So who are we?
We are known as the LDCs.
Stands for
the least developed countries.
We are the 48 least developed countries globally, which are predominantly in Africa, but also Asia, the Pacific, and the Americas.
Our countries have combined population of 898 million people.
That's 1 in 8 of all people globally, 12% of the global population.
And at this rate, that number is expected to rise to 1.7 billion people by 2050. These countries were determined by 3 criteria.
Low income. Each country's gross national income per capita is under $900. Human assets, measured through a composite human asset index. Economic vulnerability, as measured through a composite economic vulnerability index.
Being the least developed nations also makes us some of the poorest.
72% of our population live on less than $2 per day.
Only 35% of the people have access to electricity, and only 1% have telephone lines.
Only 59% of adults are literate, meaning almost half of our working populations cannot read or write.
Being so limited in capabilities, development is very slow and difficult, but it's a vicious cycle, with the lack of development being a cause of these difficulties.
The lack of development and infrastructure in our countries, we are the smallest contributor to climate change, creating only 5.7% of global emissions in 2015.
The least developed countries contribute the least to climate change. Bangladesh produces a total of 0.1% of global emissions. Compare that to a huge 24% that the USA produces.
Despite being a tiny contributor to climate change, our nations face many of its impacts. Fragile location is a large contributor to our effectiveness, with many of our countries being vulnerable to natural disasters, such as tropical storms. Many have high drought or flood risk, and often they have inconsistent and difficult access.
The tiny Pacific island nation of Kiribati is already facing terrible land loss due to rising sea levels.
In Nepal, growing rainfalls combined with more rapid snowmelt is causing devastating increase in flooding in the lowlands.
From 1998 to 2002, there was an average of 256 floods and landslides. In 2007 alone, floods and landslides caused more than 500,000 people to become food insecure.
On the other hand, an estimate of 135 million people globally will become environmental refugees by 2020 due to desertification. This is worse felt in sub-Saharan Africa.
Eastern Africa's farms have been suffering from increasing crop and livestock loss due to variations in annual rainfall in recent decades.
These environmental impacts also cause economic difficulties in the countries they affect, and in the poorest nations this is most significant. 95% of cultivated land in East Africa is used for rain-irrigated farming, and 80% of East Africans rely on farming as their primary source of income, meaning the majority of people are highly affected by precipitation levels.
As farming accounts for 40% of the East African GDP, a situation like this is not only thrown communities that are already struggling into an even lower condition of poverty, but affects the entire nation economy.
Kase and Hansen, simple measures such as planting flexibility and rainwater collection can help East African farmers counteract the crop and livestock losses from the effects of climate change. East African governments do not have the funds to introduce mass rainwater collection schemes or educate the vast population on planting flexibility.
In 2010, Bangladesh ranked at the top among 16 countries who are at extreme risk of climate change impacts, according to the Maplecroft Climate Change Vulnerability Index.
It is facing the greatest risk of their population, ecosystem and business environment as a result of climate change.
It is vulnerable to climate change impacts due to extreme levels of poverty and a high dependency on agriculture.
The Bangladesh government has the lowest capacity of all countries to adapt to predicted changes in the climate.
Environmental threats include increased frequency and severity of cyclones, heavier rainfall in monsoon season, and warmer and more humid weather. A study on rising sea levels in Bangladesh reveals that the rise is significantly higher in Bangladesh compared to the rest of the world.
1/5 of the country is likely to be submerged due to sea level rise of 1 metre by the end of the century, displacing millions of the coastal population.
It is predicted that over 35 million will be climate refugees by 2050.
Environmental threats go hand in hand with health threats. Dr. Paul Epstein of Harvard Medical School warns that climate change has potential impacts on health in three major ways.
In conditions favourable to outbreaks of infectious diseases,
Increasing the potential for transmission for vector-borne diseases,
delaying the future control of diseases. Impacts of climate change on human health are a great concern in regards to the population.
15% of its 162 million people live within 1 metre from high tides.
One of the most damaging natural disasters into the country was the flood of 1998. It continued for 65 days and affected approximately 68% of geographical area. Similar magnitude followed in 2004 and 2007. During the floods, disease was especially predominant.
Additionally, between 21% and 46% of the Bangladesh are at risk of drinking contaminated water.
And on another note, disastrous situations have an impact on the work and wages for the urban poor. It becomes scarcer and the prices of necessities increase.
This imposes severe pressure on the poor who are dependent on daily wages for survival. Bhutan is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change.
The impacts are high dependence on climate-sensitive sectors, agriculture and hydropower.
Of economic development, 70% of the population engaged in subsistence agriculture.
Geography, fragile mountain ecosystem, earthquakes, increased risk of disasters such as flash flood, droughts, forest fire, and landslides.
Potential impacts of climate change.
Changes in temperature and precipitation patterns and increased vulnerability of large group of this population. 80% of Bhutanese practice subsistence farming.
On the topic of water resources, the changes in the hydrological cycle, such as lower winter flows in streams and intense monsoon, rains may infect the drinking water and the supplies.
Temperatures may cause species and ecosystems to shift, and species at higher elevations and other species unable to migrate to become extinct. Bhutan's national development philosophy is gross national happiness.
In East Timor, during the La Nina years, above normal rainfall leads to increase of flooding and landslide, while El Nino years are associated with droughts.
Satellite data also indicates that sea level has risen near East Timor by about 9 millimetres per year since 1993.
As well as this, ocean acidification has also been increasing. When extra carbon dioxide reacts with seawater, it causes the ocean to become more acidic. This then impacts the growth of corals and organisms that construct their skeletons from carbonate minerals. These species are critical to the balance of tropical reef ecosystems.
This causes changes within the country, such as the wet season period from December to May and the dry season period from June to November. Community members now have difficulty relying on traditional calendars for determining appropriate times for plants and harvesting crops.
All communities involved are dependent upon rain-fed agriculture and livestock for their livelihoods. Climate variability and change therefore severely affects and threatens the livelihoods of these communities. Changes in the climate alongside large-scale deforestation have been identified as contributing factors to the loss and drying up of water sources.
In the majority of communities, there is increase in mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases.
For example, malaria and dengue were outlined as the result of changes in temperature and weather.
With warmer temperatures arising, mosquitoes will move into previously inhospitable areas and higher altitudes, and therefore disease transmission seasons may last longer.
By the World Health Organization in 2002, estimated that 154,000 deaths annually were attributed to climate change.
If there are any more intense rainfall events coupled with continued rates of land clearing, then injury and death from flooding and landslides may increase.
Scientific evidence also outlines that there is expected to be a continued decrease in rainfall during the dry season, which will contribute to a significant impact upon highland populations and availability in water supplies.
We greatly appreciate the need for immediate action in tackling climate change. In urgent global endeavours to halt emission production, shift to sustainable energy production, stop deforestation, pollution, and water use, and create ecologically friendly agricultural systems. This, however, will present us with further problems.
We only provide 1.11% of global exports. This isn't very much, but to us it's vital. And the loss of our export trade would have terrible effects on our economy.
And collectively, 53% of our exports are fuel. Global sustainability will affect our trade.
For our economies to survive, we need the support of northern nations to assist us in setting up alternative fair trade schemes with sustainable exportation systems.
To improve our general quality of life, eradicate poverty within our nations, and eliminate disparity, we will need to develop our economies and infrastructure, and yet development of this kind contributes vastly to climate change.
Developed countries have many systems in place to protect their citizens from the effect of climate change, both environmentally and economically, such as early warning signs, evacuation plans, insurance system, strong social safety nets, and functional emergency services.
Most developing countries do not have these protection systems, nor the funds to create processes rapidly enough to deal with immediate threats of climate change. We require large-scale initiatives to adapt to the changing climate and facilitate to help recover from the effects we cannot adapt to. In Nepal, studies have shown that renewable energy sourcing measures such as microhydro, solar power, biogas, and improvement of cooking stoves can have very positive long-term environmental effects, as well as improve health, create employment opportunities, and increase environmental awareness generally.
Likewise, improved waste disposal can not only reduce pollution of land and waterways, but also reduce air pollution through abolishing the need to burn waste.
However, Nepal does not have the capability to set up these infrastructures alone.
Even though Indonesia is not considered a least developed country, it is still vulnerable to climate change. This is an example of a country that is still trying to develop and become more sustainable, but cannot as they do not have the right resources or funds.
Indonesia is affected by various types of natural disasters, including floods, droughts, earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions.
The shock of climate change are already harshly felt in Indonesia, with more frequent droughts, heat waves, and floods, and will impact the increasing threat to the country's development.
As the Indonesian population grows, climate change-induced natural disasters will impact a greater number of people and their assets, making it more difficult for them to rise out of poverty. 40% of Indonesia's population is at risk of such hazards, and their number will increase under climate change, which is expected to worsen droughts on southern islands, floods and cyclone intensity across the country, and sea level rise effects in coastal areas.
Food security in Indonesia will be threatened by climate change, and the largest concern for Indonesia with regards to the impacts of climate change is the risk of decreased food security.
Food security and water availability will be heavily affected by temperature increase, shorter growing season, unpredicted rainfall, and saltwater intrusion.
Climate roughness and higher evaporation and plant transpiration, erosion and deforestation, the recharge of rainwater into the soil will decrease.
This means that the replenishment of the groundwater resources will decrease considerably, leading to lowering groundwater tables and empty wells, lack of drinking water, and the lack of irrigation water for gardens and fields.
Due to rainfall changes, extreme events including droughts and floods will increase in the southern regions of Indonesia. For the future droughts, especially during the La Nina events, are expected to have more serious impact on the south than temporary rainfalls increase. Although shorter and more intense rainy season will probably lead to more intense floods.
Additional effect of climate change is sea level rise, which could have a major impact along Indonesia's 81,000 kilometres of coastline. A total sea level rise of 50 centimetres, combined with ongoing land subsidence in Jakarta Bay, could permanently inundate Jakarta and Bekasi's densely populated area, affecting 270,000 people.
Metre sea level rise could flood 405,000 hectares of coastal lands and indirectly affect an additional 1 million hectares, particularly in northern Java, eastern Sumatra, and southern Sulawesi.
It would affect 17 million people in the country. Sea level rise will reduce farming and coastal livelihoods.
Sea level rise would also be likely to affect fish and prawn production. An overall effect would reduce the potential average income.
Long-term development in Indonesia is jeopardized by environmental degradation and climate change. Much of the country's economic growth has been driven by the extraction of natural resources at the expense of the environment. Indonesia is also one of the world's top emitters of greenhouse gases, and the deforestation rate is one of the highest in the world.
Indonesia has been involved in many conferences and agreements. One example is Indonesia has signed the agreement to the Kyoto Protocol on 13th of July 1998.
Then a lot has happened. notably in the field of the clean development mechanism, although less so in other fields.
Strategic development goals, known as the 9 Agenda Priorities, consist with a national commitment to climate change resilience. Renewable energy sources are underdeveloped, with barriers but few incentives. Modern technical equipment in Indonesia is not locally produced, therefore has to be imported.
Incentives. At the same time, there are barriers, but few incentives in Indonesia are for the development of renewable energy.
Development of renewable energy has slowed, while energy policies may call for development of renewable sources, supporting instruments such as fiscal and financial incentives have not been fully developed.
This could be because of the corruption within Indonesia and its government.
That is ranked 110 on the UN Human Development Index and labelled as medium development level, is struggling so intensely with overcoming the effects of climate change and fulfilling their commitments to sustainability, it is highly probable that we, the least developed countries, will have even more trouble.
It is only possible to overcome these challenges without the help of the northern nations, but it will be a slow process for nations that already suffer more than the developed countries.
The North will commit to assisting us build our economies with consideration of the environment and aid us in our struggles with the impacts of climate change. We will not only have access to our basic human rights, but be preventing our countries resorting to the desperate, unsustainable measures of development.
We, the LDCs, are happy to commit to global sustainability goals.
But we implore the nations with more political power, economic strength and resilience to the environmental crisis to assist us in our commitments.